Hello, so today we'll be discussing the statement of cash flows. So tapos na natin yung financial analysis, no? At I told you I told you a while ago na masino na natin yung yung financial analysis kasi mas mahirap yung itong cash flows. Pero what I mean by that is that it requires more explaining on my part because medyo nakakagulo ito, no? So in this chapter, you should be able to indicate the primary purpose of the statement of cash flows, distinguish among operating, investing, and financing activities, explain the impact of the explain the impact of the product life cycle on a company's cash flows, steps in preparation of statement of cash flows, and prepare statement of cash flows, syempre, using one of the two approaches, either the indirect one or the direct method. So let's define what a cash flow is. Cash flow is the total amount of money being transferred into and out of a business. Statement of cash flows is a financial statement that shows how changes in balance sheet accounts and income affects cash and cash equivalents and breaks the analysis down to operating, investing, and financing activities. The primary purpose of the statement of cash flows is to provide information about cash receipts, cash payments, and the net changes in cash resulting from the operating, investing, and financing activities of a company during the period. We have three parts of a cash flow or the statement of cash flows. We have cash flow from the operating activities, from the investing activities, and the financing activities. So in order to make a statement of cash flows or to better understand it, we should know the difference between these all of these three. Okay. Okay. In the statement of cash flows, we compute for all of the operating, investing, and financing activities separately. So normally we compute for the operating activities first. So the operating activities, cash from operating activities focuses on the cash inflows and outflows from a company's main business activities. Okay, so either collecting from customers, payment of salaries, payment of supplies. These are the common common activities in a business involving cash. Okay, so as long as it is the in the ordinary course of business, from the sales of the merchandise, from the payments of the liabilities, those are considered the operating activities. Or another way of understanding operating activities is that it affects the net income. Okay, so any item that affects the net income, it also affects the operating activities. Well, so we have two methods in solving the in computing for the operating activities. We have the direct method and the indirect one. So using the direct method, statement of cash flows presents the specific cash flows associated with items that affects cash flows. Okay, uh, yung direct na nag-affect sa mga cash flows, we compute them separately or specifically. While the indirect method of presenting starts from the net income, working back to cash flows from operating activities. So if we're using the indirect method, we start from the net income, okay, whatever the provided net income is, then we uh, then we just adjust the net income in order to get the operating activities or cash flows from operating activities. Because remember, operating activities affects the net income, but not every item in the net income affects cash. So merong items na mga net income na hindi involved ang cash. Okay? So yung mga items na hindi involved yung cash, we adjust it in order to get the cash flows from the operating activities. So an example of uh, an item in the net income which do not involve cash is the depreciation expense. Okay, walang income ang nagaganap or ang nagpo-flow in the depreciation expense. So we adjust it, we we add back the depreciation expense in order to get the cash flows. But depreciation expense are not the only items. So we'll get to that. First is the direct method. Most items needed in the operating activities is found on the income statement because it is known as the statement of operations. Okay, so yun nga yung sinabi ko. Yung operating activities involve the net income or those in the income statement. And in current assets and current liabilities because it is currently used for the current operation. Okay, so operating activities also involve the current assets and current liabilities or the working capital. Okay, we all know what working capital is, right? So it affects those because it is used currently for the current operations. So ginagamit na natin yon in the operation. So it is affected in the operating activities. So just take note that operating activities involve the current assets and the current liabilities in the balance sheet. Okay. Make a mental note or take a note on that because you will be needing that later. So we have the formulas in the direct method. Take note na direct method lang to. We have the cash received from customers. First, we have the net sales. Okay? Yung sales natin for the year, we add the beginning accounts receivable. It is before the allowance for doubtful accounts. So meaning, hindi pa na-deduct yung allowance for doubtful accounts natin. So if we add the net sales and the beginning accounts receivable, we get the amount that we can collect for the year. The total amount that we can collect, right? So imagine merong utang ang mga customer mo. That is the beginning accounts receivable. So may utang sila tapos we sold merchandise or nagbenta tayo on account. So meron nadagdagan yung utang nila. That is the net sales. Nadagdagan yung utang nila, right? Tapos from that, we deduct the ending accounts receivable or yung ending na utang nila. So, if we deduct the accounts receivable, it is also, I take note that it is also before allowance for doubtful accounts, meaning we add back the allowance for doubtful accounts, or it is before we deduct the allowance for doubtful accounts. So we get the cash received from customers. So, to sum it up, may utang yung mga customers mo at the beginning of the year. Tapos, nagbenta ka on account again. So, nadagdagan yung utang nila. That is the net sales. Tapos, we deduct yung yung natirang utang nila at the end of the year. So, that is the collections. Yun yung nakolektang natin from galing sa mga utang nila. Right? So, that is the cash received from customers. Next is the cash payments to suppliers. yung mga binayaran nating utang natin. Yeah, the cost of goods sold plus ending inventory less beginning inventory plus accounts payable and less ending accounts payable. So cash payments to supplier. So first we compute the this solution. Under this solution kasi, we have two computations. First, we have to compute the purchases. And next, we compute for the cash payments. So, yung purchases, we can compute it using the first three parts. We compute it using these three. So, ang ano kasi, ang solution ng cost of goods sold, right, is the beginning inventory, yung merchandise natin at the beginning of the year, plus yung purchases. So, ito yung dapat nating kinukuha yung purchases. So, beginning inventory plus purchases, yung bibilhin natin. So, that is, so beginning inventory at plus purchases, this is the goods available for sale. So, meaning, ito yung merchandise na pwede nating ibenta. Right? So, meron pa tayong merchandise at the beginning of the year, tapos bumili tayo. So, at yung total na lang dalawa, yun yung pwede nating ibenta, right? So, less yung binenta natin or yung cost of goods sold, yun yung binenta natin. Then we get the ending inventory or yung merchandise natin at the end of the year, right? So, we just uh, we just compute it backwards. So, instead na beginning inventory plus purchases less ending inventory is equal to cost of goods sold. Baliktarin mo yun, you get the cost of goods sold plus ending inventory less beginning inventory. So you get the purchases, right? So now we got the purchases. From that purchases, we can now compute for the for the cash payments. So we compute for the cash payments using the accounts beginning and ending accounts payable and the purchases. So accounts payable and purchases ang kailangan natin for the cash payments. So at the beginning of the year, meron tayong utang na or beginning accounts payable. Tapos i-add natin yung purchases or yung mga binili natin on account or binili natin pero di natin binayaran. So madadagdagan yung yung utang natin. So we have increase in accounts payable to. Tapos we deduct the ending accounts payable or yung i-deduct natin yung utang natin at the end of the year. So, makukompute natin yung binayaran natin. Right? So, beginning accounts payable plus purchases less ending accounts payable, we get the cash payments to suppliers. So, yun nga yung computation ng cash payments to suppliers. Basically, we will compute for two, the purchases using the first three, and the cash payments using the bottom two, and the computed purchases. Okay. Next is the cash payments for expenses. So, mga binayaran natin para sa mga expense natin. Okay, so basically, ang co-compute natin is the expense under the cash basis, right? Kasi most of the time, yung expense natin is under the accrual basis. So, meaning kahit hindi pa natin nababayaran, yung expense, we record it as expense anyway. Kasi nga it is incurred kahit na hindi pa paid. So, it is already an expense. So we just compute for yung mga expenses na binayaran natin. And this, we compute it using first, yung expense na re-record natin for the year. Yung mga kahit di pa natin binayaran is we recorded it as expense anyway kasi nga we incurred it. So kunin natin yon yung mga expenses plus the beginning accrued expense. Okay? Yung beginning accrued expense plus the ending prepaid expense less yung ending accrued expense and less yung beginning prepaid expense. So bale dalawa yung ano mo. Tig-dalawa yung i-add at dalawa din yung i-deduct. Okay? So, ano naman ang explanation kung bakit ganito yung computation natin? Uh, we have, kung i-explain ko to, we have two sections, the accrued part and the prepaid part, right? So yung accrued, we just we just compute for yung mga binayaran na natin sa accrued, right? So basically, yung beginning na di pa natin binayarang expense, this is the accrued expenses, beginning accrued expense, plus yung mga re-record nating expenses for the year, that is the expenses under the accrual basis. Tapos, yun yung total na expense na babayaran dapat natin, right? That is yung total na expense na babayaran natin. Less yung ending accrued expense or yung at the end of the year, yung amount na di pa natin binayaran. So this is the ending accrued expense. If we deduct it, so we get the expenses paid, right? So ito na yung binayaran na natin, expense. Tapos, under naman sa prepaid expense, uh, ang prepaid expense kasi, we have the beginning prepaid expense, right? Beginning. Yung mga binayaran natin noon, pero hindi pa na-incur as expense. So we paid it in the past, pero it is not yet an expense, so prepaid expense pa siya. Plus, yung additional payments for prepaid expense. So, yung mga additional na payment in advance natin. So, ito yung kinukumpit natin, yung additional payment in advance. So, beginning prepaid expense plus additional payments in advance or additional prepaid expenses. Less ending prepaid expense or yung mga hindi pa natin na-incur at the end of the year. It is the expenses. It or equals the expenses na na-incur na natin. Okay? I repeat, the beginning prepaid expense, yung mga payments natin in the past pero hindi pa natin na-record as expense, plus yung mga additional payments in advance, less yung ending prepaid expense, is equal to the expenses incurred. So yung kukumputin natin is yung additional payments in advance. Kasi nga, doon tayo nag-incur ng cash. Right? So, we just baliktarin natin. Ending prepaid expense plus yung expense na re-record natin for the year. And less the beginning prepaid expense to get the payments in advance or yung mga cash payments. So we just combine the two kasi nga yung expenses na dito is we have the merong portion na accrued expense and prepaid expense. So pagtitipunin natin ito, yung dalawang computation na sinabi ko, and we get the cash payments for expenses. Okay? So just memorize the formula. Pero kung di nyo ma-memorize, just uh, understand or recall what I just explained to you. And last is the payment for income taxes. So yung mga binayaran natin for tax. So, bale pareho lang din naman ito sa explanation ko sa accrued expense. First, we have the beginning income tax payable or yung mga income tax natin pero di pa natin nababayaran. Plus yung income tax expense or yung mga or additional tax natin na dapat bayaran na natin. So, yung pag inad mo yung dalawa, we get yung total na dapat nating bayaran for the year, no? So we we less yung ending income tax payable or yung di pa natin nabayaran at the end of the year. And we get the cash payments for income tax or yung mga binayaran natin for tax. Okay, so to get the cash flows from operating activities, we just add all the cash received. Then we deduct the cash payments. These three, yung cash payments. And we get the cash from operating activities. So kung mako-compute nyo na yon, it depends kung mas malaki ba yung cash received or mas malaki ba yung mga cash payments, right? So kung mas malaki yung cash received natin, we call it the cash inflow. Kasi nga mas maraming inflow of cash or mas marami tayong nakuhang cash. Pero kung mas malaki naman yung cash payments, it is the cash outflow. Kasi nga mas maraming nag-outflow or nawalan tayong pera. So, you indicate it at the bottom. So, either cash inflow from operating activities or cash outflow from operating activities. Tapos you indicate the amount. Here we have the example. But I will explain the example next meeting na lang kasi medyo matagal na tong yung video na to. So that will be all for today, class. Thank you for listening. Read your notes or itong isasan ko na ito. You read it. Tapos you wait for my discussion to supplement your studies, right? So that will be all. Thank you and goodbye.